Good evening. It's time for another edition of On the Porch with Pastor. And I have some guests on the porch with Pastor tonight. They're off camera, but I have three VIPs with me tonight. One is my lovely wife, Laura. She's right over there. Say hi, Laura.
Hello.
One's my charming, witty, intelligent daughter, Holly. She's over on this side. There's her hand. And the other is my youngest, and there he is. And, but those of you who watched the previous episode of On the Porch with Pastor know that I took issue with Mr. Gully about these names. Well, he didn't help me out much tonight because check this out. Okay, I've seen that and I understand it's been three different ways that I've heard it. I've heard it Annice, I've heard it Annice, and I've heard it Annice. But we're going to say Annice just because that's just what I want to do. So forgive me. But here we go. Annice. When I was young and unattached, the women in my Quaker meeting paid me considerable attention. But then Quaker women tend to take an inordinate interest in people who need help. And I needed help. I was 6 feet tall and weighed 110 pounds. One of the women, Annice, took me on as a project. One Sunday after worship, she approached me. "Steve," she said, "why don't you come to my house for dinner?" Steve wasn't my name, but for as long as I knew Annice, that's what she called me. When I tried to explain my name was Phil, she told me there was nothing wrong with the name Steve, and I should be proud of it. After all, Stephen was the first Christian martyr. Annice was a retired missionary and had a high opinion of Christian martyrs. Annice had taught at the Quaker Girls' School in Ramallah, Jordan. During the Six-Day War, an Israeli tank commander drove his tank into the school's compound. Annice stood with her hands on her hips and blocked his way. When he stuck his head out of the turret, Annice ordered him to leave immediately. "Shame on you," she told him. "Shame on you for fighting. What would your mother think?" The battle-hardened tank commander, more accustomed to soldiers than to 60-year-old Quaker missionaries from Indiana, looked Annice up and down, climbed back in his tank, and drove away. I didn't know this about Annice until after she died, when one of her nephews told the story during her memorial service. But from what I knew of Annice, it seemed to fit. Annice lived next to the meeting house. She invited me home every Sunday after Quaker meeting for pot roast and peas. The meat was invariably tough and leathery, the peas burnt. Annice would hover over me while I ate, telling me to clean my plate because people in Africa didn't have any food. Once I suggested that we mail them her pot roast. It probably would have kept. "Don't be ungrateful, Steve," she said. "No one likes a smart aleck. That's probably why you're not married yet." Annice wasn't married either, but I didn't dare point that out. In the Quaker faith, if you want to be a pastor, others first have to notice your gifts for ministry. It isn't enough to say you feel called to it. Annice was the first person to tell me I should be a pastor. "Steve," she said, "I think you should become a pastor." I told her I didn't feel called to the pastoral ministry. She drew herself up, put her hands on her hips — it was the Six-Day War all over again — and said, "Do you know what calling is? Calling is when you see something that needs done, so you do it. We need pastors, so you should do it." I promised her I would pray about it. I really didn't want to be a pastor, but by then it was too late. Annice had already made up my mind. Since I was engaged to be married, I told my fiancée that Annice wanted me to be a pastor. She asked, "Why don't you tell her you don't want to be a pastor?" "I've been trying for 5 years to tell her my name isn't Steve. I don't think it'll do any good," I said. So I quit my job and went away to college for 8 years and became a pastor. I figured it'd be easier in the long run. Annice came to hear my first sermon. She walked up to me after I'd finished speaking. "Steve, maybe I was wrong," she said. "Sometimes we think that being a Christian means being nice." Annice never subscribed to that notion. Beneath her gruff exterior was a woman who meant every word she said. She wasn't interested in being nice. She was interested in doing good, and she tried never to confuse the two. Even after I married, I continued to join her for Sunday dinner. I'd go to visit and would have to stand. Her chairs were piled high with clothing for refugees half a world away. "Steve, if you want to be a pastor, you're going to have to do better," she'd say. "My becoming a pastor was your idea," I would point out. "There you go again, being a smart aleck. Why don't you make yourself useful and take me to the post office to mail off these clothes?" I stayed at Annice's Quaker meeting for 5 years, then moved on. But scarcely a day passes that I don't wish folks cared more about doing good than being nice. When Annice died, I returned to her Quaker meeting for the memorial service. One man stood and told how Annice had taught him to read. Cassie Swarn from the AME church down on Vine Street talked about how sometimes Annice showed up at her church, a lone white face in a sea of black and brown. "She came for the music," Cassie said. Annice liked her music robust. It pained her to sit in the meeting house and listen to our feeble attempts at singing, so twice a year she worshiped at the AME church. Annice has been gone for over 10 years. Whenever I eat pot roast, I think of her and clean my plate. And that concludes tonight's edition of On the Porch with Pastor. Next time we're going to read a tribute to Ned Ludd. I'll say this for Mr. Gully. He's got some interesting names in this book. But I've had some experiences with some folks like Sister Annice. One of them watches these broadcasts. Don't make me call you by name, but you know who you are. And I fully expect to see you show up in the comments section, if you're self-aware, that is. But glad you tuned in tonight. Thanks for joining us, and check in with us again next time when we'll talk about Ned Ludd. Jesus is coming soon, so eyes to the skies.